The stone tiers of Constantinople's Hippodrome tower overhead like a living wall, every seat filled with a roaring mass of spectators. 50,000 voices fuse into a single, relentless thunder. And at the center of that storm, a woman named Helena is chained to the ground, forced onto her hands and knees. Iron restraints cut into her skin. Torn fabric hangs from her body, and strips of fresh punishment mark her back. The scorching sand burns her palms. The sun has pinned her here for hours. Blood trails down her arms, disappearing into the same ground that has absorbed centuries of suffering. The audience jeers, laughs, wagers. Then another sound rises. A heavy tread, harsh breaths. The crowd's tone sharpens instantly. Helena twists her neck just enough to glimpse soldiers urging a massive creature forward. A bull, towering, powerful, its horns catching the light, and it is being driven straight toward her. This is not an execution. This is a performance sanctioned by empire. And before you learn what happened when that animal reached her, you must understand the stage upon which this horror unfolded. Here is the part of Byzantine history no classroom ever mentioned. You may know the shimmering mosaics, the grandeur of Hagia Sophia, the legal reforms, the emperors cast in marble and legend. But few are taught that the Hippodrome served another purpose, a public arena where fear was shaped into obedience. For nearly a millennium, it became the empire's most effective tool, where humiliation, punishment, and political theater merged into a single system of control.
And what most people never learn is this. The Byzantines developed deliberate, chilling methods to break any woman who dared to challenge the political balance. Tonight, you'll see why the Hippodrome was far more than a racetrack. It was a stage crafted for psychological destruction. Back on the arena floor, Helena feels the bull's breath warming the raw lashes across her back. The creature stands so close, she can sense its weight through the sand. The crowd's chant shifts into a slow, pounding rhythm. They are not here for mercy. They are here for a demonstration, one designed by men who understood how to shatter a human being without ending her life. Helena, 23 years old, born into a respected blue faction household, has no idea that several women before her have already collapsed under similar displays this week. She doesn't know her torment has been orchestrated by her faction's rivals, meant to send a public warning. She doesn't know she will leave this arena alive, but forever changed. All she can register is the heat of the sand, the bite of the chains, the overwhelming roar of 50,000 voices, and the enormous silhouette looming over her. The bull lowers its head. You may understand the sound of a crowd, but do you understand how a government can weaponize that sound? How a simple rivalry can evolve into a system of intimidation? This is the story of how Byzantium's factions didn't just divide the city. They helped create a society where public punishment became acceptable spectacle, and why some of the empire's harshest displays were aimed at women. The reason this chapter of history rarely appears in our textbooks is simple. It exposes how an empire cloaked its harshest practices behind glittering mosaics and proud declarations of Christian virtue. If you want the truths that were intentionally buried, like the video and subscribe, because what you learn about Helena and that bull will permanently reshape the way you see the Byzantine world. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's continue, because the reality is darker than the legend. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was unlike any arena inherited from Rome. It was something far more calculated. Originally constructed in the 3rd century and later expanded by Constantine, it evolved into the empire's beating political core, a colossal structure stretching over 400 meters, capable of holding crowds that seemed endless. At its head stood the Kathisma, the imperial platform, where the ruler watched the city's passions explode below. The arena floor wasn't simple earth. It was layered with costly Egyptian sand, chosen for grip, visibility, and symbolic grandeur. Beneath that surface lay corridors, holding chambers and operational rooms, an underworld designed not only for spectacle, but for control. To understand Helena's fate, you must understand the system that fueled the violence, the factions. Byzantium was split into two dominant identities, the blues and the greens. What began as racing teams transformed into political machines, religious movements, neighborhood powers, and at times, full-scale militias. A person's faction wasn't a preference, it was an inheritance, a badge, a lifelong allegiance. These groups dominated districts, ran underground networks, and even held their own captives. When tensions erupted, the streets turned into battlegrounds, and the Hippodrome, massive, echoing, and charged with emotion, became their proving ground. At the races, your faction dictated everything, where you sat, what you wore, even how loudly you cheered. A moment of hesitation, a misplaced gesture, or cheering at the wrong time could mark you as a traitor. And your own faction members, not the authorities, would deliver the consequences. This fierce loyalty gave emperors a weapon. By favoring one faction and restraining the other, rulers kept the population divided, emotional, and too busy fighting each other to focus their anger on the throne. And when someone needed to be publicly erased, the Hippodrome became the perfect stage. Tens of thousands watching, factions screaming, and the empire sending a message that no one would forget. Understand this clearly. This wasn't leftover brutality from some pagan age. It was intentional policy inside a Christian empire that claimed moral superiority. The display itself was the strategy. Helena was trapped within that system. At 23, raised in a prominent blue household and expected to marry into blue leadership, her entire life was built on faction identity, until it all collapsed. In 532 AD, Emperor Justinian's harsh taxation and controversial reforms pushed both blues and greens to a breaking point. For the first time in memory, they stood on the same side, against him. The spark ignited what would become the deadliest public uprising in the city's history, the Nika Revolt. Picture the moment, January 18th, 532 AD. The Hippodrome is overflowing. Chariots line the track, ignored. From both factions, one chant rises, Nika, Nika, a unified demand for change. But this time, the chant isn't for sport. It's aimed squarely at the emperor. 50,000 voices demand that Justinian surrender power. For the first time in living memory, the rival factions stand together, directing their fury upward, not sideways. Justinian watches from the Kathisma, hearing a united population challenge him openly. This is no longer a disturbance, it is a political reckoning, unlike anything the empire has faced. He sends envoys to calm the masses. Their words vanish under the roar. They withdraw, unable to restore order. And in that moment, Justinian chooses a path that will define his rule for generations. He commands the gates to be sealed, every entrance, every exit. In an instant, tens of thousands of spectators, ordinary families who came for a race, find themselves trapped. The shouts fade into stunned silence, then confusion, then rising fear. People push toward the exits only to discover they have been locked from the outside. The realization spreads quickly. They are no longer an audience. They are captives, enclosed with an emperor who has decided to crush the rebellion in the most absolute way he can. You're probably asking what came next. Justinian had already summoned the one man every rebel feared, General Belisarius, the commander whose campaigns reshaped continents. He entered the Hippodrome through the imperial corridor with 3,000 disciplined soldiers, armored infantry carrying close-range weapons. No arrows, no distance. This was meant to be direct. Forming a solid line across the arena floor, the troops advanced steadily toward a crowd that had nowhere to escape. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a state-ordered suppression carried out with brutal efficiency. Unarmed civilians tried desperately to flee, climbing over seats and scrambling toward the locked exits. Panic overtook the arena as Belisarius's men pushed forward, section by section, leaving no portion of the stands untouched. The cries rising from inside the Hippodrome carried through the city. Those seated high above watched the soldiers move upward toward them, realizing there was no safe corner left. Some attempted to resist, others pleaded. Many simply froze in disbelief. By nightfall, the arena floor was unrecognizable.
Pathways were blocked with fallen bodies, and soldiers struggled to move through the tightly packed spaces. Estimates from contemporary chroniclers vary, but most agree that tens of thousands lost their lives that day, one of the deadliest single events in the empire's history.
This was the cost of faction unity. This was the emperor's reply to collective defiance. And this is the true legacy of Byzantium's faction system. Not simply a tool of control, but a structure that, when threatened, could justify devastation on an unimaginable scale. Yet the massacre was only the far end of the spectrum. To understand Helena, still chained, still trembling as the bull loomed behind her, we must recognize that her suffering came from the same calculated logic. Her fate wasn't an accident of chaos. It was an extension of the empire's deliberate machinery of intimidation. What happened that day became the largest mass killing ever recorded in a stadium. Justinian's crisis was resolved, the alliance between factions evaporated, and the survivors, along with everyone in Constantinople, were left with a permanent warning. The emperor was willing to unleash catastrophic force on his own people to preserve his rule. If you feel uneasy hearing this, you should. This isn't myth or exaggeration. Multiple Byzantine chroniclers, Procopius, Marcellinus, John Malalas, describe the event. They disagree on the exact count, but all agree it reached into the tens of thousands. But the violence within the stands was not the only horror unfolding. While soldiers advanced through the crowd, imperial officials moved among the chaos with prepared lists. They sought out specific targets, influential faction members, political rivals, wealthy dissenters. These individuals were not executed in the arena. They were pulled aside, escorted down to the sand, and reserved for something more controlled, something meant to send a more personal message. And among those singled out were women. The women taken that day were not rebels. They were simply wives and daughters of blue and green officials who had challenged Justinian. Their only crime was belonging to the wrong families. What happened to them afterward exposes how the Byzantine state weaponized gendered humiliation to reinforce obedience. Remember this, because it explains what ultimately awaited Helena. 73 women were detained in the aftermath of the uprising, all from prominent households, all tied even indirectly to the opposition. Most had done nothing more than sit beside relatives in the stands. But the empire needed a demonstration, not only against dissent, but against any woman whose status might embolden her. For 3 days, they were held beneath the Hippodrome in cramped chambers. No comfort, no support, no sense of when it would end. On the 4th day, their purpose became clear. The arena reopened to a restricted audience, around 10,000 carefully chosen loyalists invited to witness a lesson in hierarchy. One by one, the women were escorted onto the sand. Just days earlier, many of them had worn fine fabrics and jewelry. Now they appeared in rough garments, stripped of rank and recognition. Their hair, once symbols of status, had been crudely chopped away. Some showed signs of mistreatment from their captivity. They were ordered to walk the full length of the 400-meter track, flanked by guards, as the crowd hurled insults and whatever objects they could find. The display was designed to reshape public memory. Once symbols of privilege, these women were now reminders of what happened when power shifted against you. Some of the women collapsed under the strain, only to be lifted and pushed forward again. Others cried openly. A few kept their gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let the crowd see fear. But by the time the procession ended, every one of them had been worn down. At the center of the arena, they were ordered to kneel, while a herald proclaimed their supposed offenses: aiding sedition, protecting fugitives, resisting imperial authority. None of these accusations were grounded in fact. They were charges of association, of lineage, of faction loyalty. Their sentences were then declared: exile, loss of property, and permanent disgrace. Escorted away, they disappeared into remote outposts of the empire, their former lives erased. This wasn't simply punishment. It was a ritual designed to dismantle a person's identity, piece by piece. And it served as preparation for something even more targeted and far more cruel. Which brings us back to the arena floor, the blistering heat, and Helena, still chained, still surrounded by a crowd hungry for spectacle. What happened to her wasn't random. It was the precise outcome of a system perfected over generations. The message was unmistakable. A woman who stepped into political territory, who challenged expectations, or who failed to uphold her family's allegiance, would lose everything. Not behind closed doors, but under the full gaze of the public. Her status, possessions, and dignity stripped away, her identity rewritten as a warning.
This pattern did not fade with time. It resurfaced whenever influential women were viewed as potential threats. Yet the Nika uprising cemented something even more unsettling. It transformed the Hippodrome into the empire's primary arena for displaying the downfall of political opponents. From that moment onward, the Byzantines elevated psychological punishment into a calculated art. One of their most distinctive methods was blinding. Over centuries, the empire refined it into a political tactic, highly symbolic, deeply feared, and devastatingly effective. Removing a rival's sight removed their future. A blinded claimant could not lead armies or contend for the throne, but they remained alive, standing as a living cautionary tale to everyone who witnessed their fate. And many of these public ceremonies took place in the Hippodrome. Take the case of Emperor Romanos IV in 1071. After suffering a major military defeat and being taken prisoner, Romanos was eventually released and returned to Constantinople. But his political enemies seized the opportunity. He was deposed, declared unfit to rule, yet still dangerous because some loyalists continued to support him. So they staged his fall in the Hippodrome. His alleged offenses were read aloud: misrule, poor leadership, jeopardizing the state. Then an official stepped forward, carrying a heated bronze rod, the tool chosen for the punishment. The crowd fell silent, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Held firmly by guards, Romanos could not move as the instrument approached. The act that followed was not merely physical, it was meant to erase his authority, his claim, and his public standing in one symbolic stroke. The moment of punishment was designed to leave an unforgettable impression. As the heated rod made contact, the crowd watched in a stunned, breathless silence. Romanos's cries rose through the arena, echoing against the stone, an unmistakable reminder of what happened to those who stood on the losing side of power. When it was done, the former emperor, now permanently removed from political life, was taken away to a monastery. He survived for 2 more years, but his presence served a purpose. Every sighting of him reinforced the lesson the authorities wanted engraved into the memory of the empire. What made the act even more chilling was its method. Blinding was often carried out not by trained specialists, but by ordinary soldiers with little expertise. Precision was irrelevant. The objective was symbolic impact. It was meant to be destabilizing, unforgettable, a warning delivered through spectacle. Historical records describe numerous variations of this practice, each intended to deliver a clear message. The state held absolute authority over the bodies and futures of those who challenged it. The Hippodrome was not simply an arena, it was a place where power demonstrated its reach. Now return to Helena, still bound in the sand, still surrounded by the roar of thousands. Her suffering was not the product of random cruelty. It was part of this same system, public, choreographed, and deeply symbolic. For men who defied imperial authority, the empire had its arsenal: removal from office, physical punishments, forced exile. But for a woman of standing who threatened the social or political balance, the method was different. They chose the bull.
In Byzantium, if you held enough influence, your downfall wasn't hidden, it was staged. A public event meant to echo through generations, turning your fate into a cautionary tale for everyone watching. But as shocking as blinding ceremonies were, they ended quickly. The empire also crafted punishments that unfolded slowly, designed to hold the crowd's gaze and deepen the psychological impact. One of the most feared involved the Hippodrome's signature spectacle, the chariot. The same vehicles that once thrilled audiences could be repurposed for executions. A captured rebel or political rival might be fastened behind a chariot, secured tightly so escape was impossible. Then, the horses were set into motion, not at their usual racing speed, but at a deliberate pace. The victim was dragged along the full length of the track, the surface rough enough to inflict severe harm over time. Guards sometimes paused the procession to assess whether the condemned still lived. If they did, the ordeal continued. If not, the display was carried to completion for the sake of the message. These punishments were reserved for the gravest offences: treason, attempted coups, plots against the emperor. And when they occurred, news spread instantly. Crowds filled every seat, drawn by fear, curiosity, and the morbid certainty that the empire intended them to witness the consequences of disloyalty. Chariot punishments and blinding rituals targeted individuals. But the Byzantine state also crafted methods designed for entire groups, especially for noble women who had fallen out of favor. Chronicles repeatedly reference a category the empire feared: women accused of violating social expectations, aligning with the wrong faction, or simply offending someone with power. Executing these women outright was often impossible. Their families held influence, and the law granted them certain protections. But their reputations and their identities could be dismantled publicly, and the Hippodrome offered the perfect setting. This ritual became known as the Procession of Shame. It began with arrest and a public declaration of accusations. Then came several days in the dim chambers beneath the arena. During this time, officials prepared the victim for display. Her hair was cut short, in a symbolic stripping of status, her fine garments replaced with coarse fabric, and she was kept under harsh conditions meant to weaken her resolve. Then came the spectacle. On a race day, between scheduled events, she would be escorted into the arena. Thousands watched as she was ordered to walk the full length of the track, guards on either side, her name and alleged offenses announced aloud. The crowd was encouraged to shout and condemn, transforming her humiliation into a civic ritual. She was required to finish the entire circuit, slowly, visibly, without falling, so that every spectator could witness the empire's message. At the end of the procession, the woman was brought to the center of the arena and forced to kneel. A herald announced her punishment, most often exile, occasionally confinement to a religious house, and only in the rarest cases, anything harsher. The purpose was never execution. It was erasing her standing, turning her into a warning for every other woman in the audience. This is the cost of challenging the order imposed on you. This was the calculated logic behind Byzantine public punishment, and it forms the essential backdrop for Helena's ordeal in the arena. Her fate was not a chaotic encounter with an animal, but the next step in a long tradition of public, symbolic subjugation. Before we return to her in the sand, understand that this pattern is not just ancient history. It reflects systems of power that repeat themselves across centuries. If you're still watching, type 1 below. Your support helps keep these hidden stories alive. And if you haven't already, like the video and subscribe. Now let's continue. The Hippodrome wasn't only a political tool for emperors, it was also a platform used by influential women to strike at their rivals. Consider Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian. She rose from a disadvantaged background to become one of the most formidable figures in Byzantine politics. But she carried memories of the aristocratic women who once dismissed her and questioned her worth. Once Theodora reached the height of power, the Hippodrome became one of her sharpest political tools. Chroniclers describe several incidents involving noble women who had publicly belittled her before she rose to the throne. Within a short time of Justinian's accession, each of them was summoned to the arena. They were subjected to the procession of shame, stripped of the symbols of their rank, their hair cut short, and marched before the same crowds that had once applauded them from privileged seats. And Theodora made sure she witnessed every moment from the kathisma. She locked eyes with each woman as they passed, making it unmistakably clear who now controlled their fate. Two of them spent the rest of their lives in exile. The third disappeared into monastic seclusion and never re-emerged in the historical record. Through the arena, Theodora demonstrated her reach. Past insults could be repaid in full, and no social rank offered protection. The message resonated. Few dared challenge her again. But Theodora's actions were, at their core, personal vendettas.
Most uses of the Hippodrome for public humiliation weren't fueled by private grudges, they were statecraft. Instruments designed to intimidate, reshape loyalty, and crush dissent. One of the most psychologically devastating displays preserved in the chronicles was known as the mock coronation. When a rival claimant failed, or when a rebellion collapsed, its leader was brought to the Hippodrome for a final ritual of humiliation. This was not mere punishment, it was theatrical, symbolic, and staged to dismantle whatever authority the rebel once held.
The captured rebel was dressed in imperial purple, a color forbidden to anyone but the emperor. A cheap imitation crown, sometimes made of bent metal or woven forms, was placed on his head. It was meant to mock, to strip the symbol of authority down to parody. Escorted into the arena with exaggerated fanfare, the pretender was seated on a throne at the center. The crowd knew the script. This was political theater, a demonstration of how easily ambition could be reduced to spectacle. Guards approached, offering false gestures of loyalty before suddenly turning on him. What began as staged ridicule shifted into real violence. The blows intensified, the robe was torn, the crown slipped. The man who moments earlier had been dressed as an emperor now struggled to remain upright. Then came the final stage of the ritual, a state-ordered execution, sometimes a swift one, sometimes a punishment meant to eliminate the rebel's claim to power without ending his life. Whatever form it took, it served a single purpose: to imprint the warning deeply into the public mind. This was the Hippodrome's ultimate role, a place where fear was shaped, rehearsed, and delivered with precision. A place where power didn't just punish, it performed. And now we return to the center of that arena, to Helena, to the chains, to the bull. Because what awaited her drew from every element of Byzantine cruelty: the personal vendettas of rulers like Theodora, the scripted humiliation of mock coronations, and the gendered targeting seen in the processions. Her ordeal was not improvisation, it was the empire's darkest craft, refined over centuries. And now, you're about to see it. You were right to question the idea of Byzantine civilization. So how did ordinary people become part of a system capable of such cruelty? How could citizens of a Christian empire watch these spectacles without rising in protest? The answer lies in familiar human psychology. First, faction loyalty. If the victim belonged to the opposing faction, their suffering became entertainment. Blues celebrated green misfortune. Greens celebrated blue humiliation. Identity turned into justification. Second, fear as governance. Every viewer understood, even if silently, that the roles could reverse at any moment. Staying in the crowd felt safer than risking the arena. Third, religious framing. The emperor claimed divine sanction. If he acted against someone, it was presented as moral necessity. Many spectators interpreted these punishments as the enforcement of cosmic order. Fourth, the rarity of spectacle. The Hippodrome dominated public life. Ordinary races happened often, but punitive spectacles were exceptional, events that drew massive attention simply because they were unforgettable. Fifth, the human capacity for cruelty. When authority allows it, when a community reinforces it, and when the target is labeled as an outsider, people can move from passive watching to active cheering. The Byzantines didn't invent this dynamic, they simply weaponized it with remarkable precision. The Hippodrome was not just an arena, it was a mechanism engineered to shape obedience through fear. A place where the state demonstrated, in the most unforgettable ways possible, that resistance would be met with consequences no one could ignore. Yet even Byzantium had methods so extreme that chroniclers recorded them only in hints and vague language. These punishments were rare, reserved for moments when the empire wanted to send a message that would echo for generations. One category involved animals, not used as killers, as in pagan Rome, but as tools of psychological destruction. The purpose was not to take a life, but to break the spirit of the condemned. To create an experience so overwhelming, so destabilizing, that it erased identity and status without shedding a drop of blood. And now we return to Helena, still chained on the burning sand. The bull approaching behind her.
You've waited for this moment. You want the truth buried by the chroniclers. Helena was never meant to die that day. The bull was not released to harm her. Guards controlled it with ropes, directing every movement. They would not allow it to strike. The intention was something else entirely. They wanted her trapped in absolute terror, unable to see the animal clearly, only to hear its rumbling breath, feel the tremor of its hooves, sense its massive presence inches away. Her wounds stung, her body shook, and every instinct screamed that the creature towering behind her could end her life in a heartbeat. The bull's role was not to attack, it was to crush her will, to turn fear into a public spectacle, to reduce a noblewoman into a trembling symbol of imperial dominance. This was psychological annihilation, Byzantium's preferred weapon when physical punishment was deemed too merciful. The crowd roared, not wagering on Helena's death, but on the moment her resolve would shatter. Would she plead? Would she lose control? Guided by handlers, the bull moved closer, not to strike, but to tower over her, its massive form casting a heavy shadow across her trembling body. The fear was overwhelming. In those stretched, agonizing minutes, Helena was certain she was about to meet a violent end. The guards let the tension build, allowing terror, not force, to break her. Her mind filled the silence with imagined horrors, far worse than any physical blow. Then, just as suddenly, the bull was led away. Helena collapsed, still bound, shaking uncontrollably. No wound had touched her, yet she was utterly undone, reduced to raw instinct, to breathless panic. And the worst part, the arena had witnessed every second. 50,000 eyes watching a noblewoman brought to complete psychological collapse. The next day, she was released and exiled. She died 2 years later, her final days lost to history. But the message landed with brutal clarity. Women across the empire understood the warning. Families recalibrated their loyalties. The political balance of Constantinople shifted because of one orchestrated moment of terror, because a bull, a captive woman, and a crowd became instruments of state power. This was Byzantine justice, public, deliberate, and devastating. Sanctioned by emperors, sustained for centuries, etched into the stones of the Hippodrome itself.
The remnants of the Hippodrome still stand in modern Istanbul. You can walk its outline, stand where Helena once knelt, and touch the very stones that absorbed centuries of fear and state-crafted spectacle. Tourists pass by unaware, seeing columns, arches, and history frozen in marble. What they don't see is the other story embedded beneath their feet. They don't know about the mass reprisals, the political mutilations, the orchestrated humiliations. They don't know how thoroughly later historians softened these events, reframing deliberate public terror as mere unrest. None of it was accidental. It was policy, designed, refined, and deployed with precision to keep a population in line. And Byzantium wasn't some chaotic fringe culture. It was educated, affluent, deeply religious. A society of poets, theologians, and jurists. Yet it still embraced tactics meant to intimidate, isolate, and dominate. Not because it had to, because it worked. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Any empire with concentrated power eventually discovers versions of these same methods. Systems that cannot be challenged will always find ways to silence challengers dramatically. The Hippodrome is simply one of the clearest, longest-running examples, a 1,000-year case study carved into stone. So what do we learn from this? First, civilization doesn't eliminate brutality. It often gives it structure, reasoning, and efficiency. Second, crowds can be shaped. Through loyalty, fear, belief, scarcity of entertainment, and the permission of authority, ordinary people can be turned into spectators of suffering. Third, the most effective form of punishment isn't physical destruction, it's public erasure. Take away a person's standing, dignity, and identity, and the damage endures far longer than any wound. This is the part of history that rarely makes it into textbooks. The part built not of mosaics and marble, but of control and caution. And its warning reaches far beyond ancient Constantinople. Helena's collapse in the arena was not the failure of her body, it was the breaking of her identity. The Byzantines understood a devastating truth: wounds can close, but public humiliation reshapes a life forever. Their spectacles were crafted not merely to punish, but to dismantle a person from the inside, to expose them, reduce them, and let thousands of voices carve a wound deeper than any physical strike. A person dies once, but someone humiliated before a crowd faces that moment again and again, carried in whispers, in glances, in memory. So remember them. Remember Helena, who never truly escaped the arena where her spirit fractured. Remember the 73 noblewomen paraded after Nika, their status stripped away in an instant. Remember the tens of thousands who lost their lives in the seats where they once gathered for celebration. Remember Romanos IV, whose downfall played out before silent witnesses. Remember every dissenter forced into parody trials, every figure used as a cautionary display, every person pulled into a public ritual meant to erase them. These were not statistics, they were human beings. Their names may be lost, buried by the same power that silenced them, but the pattern they endured survives in the historical record. And recognizing that pattern is our responsibility. Byzantium called itself the heir of Rome, the defender of faith, the guardian of civilization. Yet within its grand narrative operated a system of public coercion refined over centuries. That contradiction matters. Culture, learning, and religion do not automatically prevent abuse of power. Sometimes they provide the vocabulary that makes it easier, allowing cruelty to be framed as order, as duty, even as virtue. To understand the Hippodrome is to understand how ordinary people can be shaped into spectators of suffering, how authority can disguise intimidation as justice and turn fear into entertainment. What you've just heard is one of history's darkest chapters, a chapter most accounts avoid or soften. If you believe these people deserve to be remembered, if you think uncovering these truths matters, then subscribe to this channel. Share this video, not for numbers, but because the world needs to see what unchecked power looks like. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which moment struck you hardest. This isn't just a story from the past, it's a warning for the present. Today, the Hippodrome stands silent. The empire that once filled it with noise and terror is gone. But the methods they created, the patterns of manipulation, spectacle, and control, those survived long after the walls collapsed. Recognizing them is the first step to resisting them, to refusing to become part of the crowd that applauds suffering. And this story is only the beginning. Next time, we turn to the hidden practices of the Spanish Inquisition, procedures so structured, so quietly methodical, that Byzantine cruelty seems almost restrained in comparison. Another history buried in careful language. Another truth powerful institutions tried to conceal. You won't want to miss it. The stones of the Hippodrome still lie in modern Istanbul. They look harmless, ruins, relics, a tourist backdrop. But beneath them rests the memory of thousands whose voices were silenced and whose names were erased. Their suffering was real, their fear was real, and the system that broke them was no accident. By retelling their stories, we give them back a measure of dignity. By learning what happened, we honor their memory, and by remembering, we refuse to let their suffering vanish into the comfortable myths of civilization. Their lives teach us something timeless. Cruelty and culture can coexist. Faith can stand beside oppression. Ordinary people can be guided to cheer for things they would never condone alone. Empires, ancient or modern, excel at disguising violence under symbols of authority and order. So do not settle for the polished version of history. Seek the uncomfortable. Ask the questions that disturb.
Remember the people who were meant to be forgotten, because the cost of forgetting is always greater than the burden of knowing, even when the truth is dark, unforgiving, and painfully real. This is the story they never wanted told. Now you know it. Remember it.